Vous remercie. C'était un grand Canadien.
Thank you. He was a great Canadian. The House will now proceed to tributes to our honourable colleague, the late Honourable Ed Broadbent. I will now give the floor to the honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. I want to begin by extending my condolences on behalf of all New Democrats to the family and friends and those who loved Ed Broadbent, his partner, Francis, his family, and of course his many friends. I also want to take a moment to thank the Prime Minister and the Canadian Heritage for yesterday's state funeral. It was a fitting tribute to Ed and his incredible life. And I want to thank everyone who helped to organize it and who participated, particularly the Broadbent Institute. I shared this story at the funeral, and I want to share it again. Every time I was at an event with Ed, and I could see him in the crowd, and I was speaking at that event, I would always take a moment to invite people to applaud the legendary Ed Broadbent. I'm not sure he always wanted that type of attention, but I did it anyway. And I also took a moment to say, looking Ed right in the eyes, I would always say, Ed, you're who I want to be when I grow up. And Ed, as a very generous and compassionate person, would laugh as if it was the first time I had said that. And initially, it was maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek. And every time I said it, I meant it more and more. And I wish and I hope Ed knew how much I meant that. And the reason why I meant that I want to be Ed when I grow up, if you look at Ed's life, Ed spent his life in public service. He committed his life to a clear vision of building a fairer, more equitable world. And he believed in that vision with his entire heart, and he dedicated his life to that vision. If you look at what he did, Mr. Speaker, he was elected as a member of Parliament from the auto worker town of Oshawa by a huge margin of 15 votes. And when he won, he went on to run for leadership and won as leader, and then served for almost a decade and a half as a leader of the party. Now, that would be a great political journey, and it would have been a significant contribution, and he could have called it a career. But that wasn't enough for him. After having served as leader and retiring, many years later, he was asked to run again. And folks in this House will understand what that's like, to be the previous leader and to be asked to run again, and he agreed under Jack Layton to run again, and he won his seat in Ottawa Centre as a member of Parliament once again. Then when he finally took his retirement, again, one would say he has done his service. He has fought for working class people the way he wanted to. But it wasn't enough for him. In his retirement, when most of us would think of lots of ways to spend our retirement, he then founded an institute in his name. Didn't just found the institute, the Broadbent Institute, but was an active participant, constantly finding ways to push forward and grow the Institute so it could be a place for working class people, a place for the activists, and to train the future leadership for the movement. He was persistent in his clear pursuit of a vision of social democracy. That's not all. On top of being very active with the Institute he founded, most recently he wrote a book, again laying out his vision for social democracy. That's why it's who I want to be when I grow up, to never stop giving back, to dedicate one's life to a vision of a better world. And he made it clear what a better world would look like. For him, Ed Broadbent believed in democracy. But for him, democracy wasn't just the idea of having the right to vote, that the political right or the civic right was not sufficient, wasn't good enough. One also had to have the true elements of democracy, meaning people needed to have economic equality, economic justice. What that meant is you needed to have the right to vote, but also be able to earn a good living, to be able to have a safe place to call home, to be able to get to and from the polling station in safety, and to be able to participate meaningfully in society. He was a true believer of democracy in all of its elements. He also made it clear that he was not satisfied with New Democrats just being the conscience of Parliament. He made it absolutely clear he wanted to be Prime Minister. He believed we needed to use our power in this place to make life better for working people. Ed Broadbent croyait qu'il fallait...
Ed Broadbent believed that we needed to use the government's power to do good, to tackle those with power and protect the most vulnerable. He believed that Ottawa needed to work for people and not for billionaires. It wasn't enough for him to be the conscience of Parliament. He wanted to be Prime Minister. He didn't engage in false debates where it was a choice between respecting one's principles and winning an election. He thought that it was possible to do both things. In fact, the only way to win was to show Canadians a political platform based on principles that put their interests in top priority. We see that we can continue his work. He had the belief that Canada could and should do better.
He left behind. Back in 1989, in this very chamber, older chamber, but the same principle, he put forward a motion 35 years ago almost to rid Canada of child poverty. At the time, nearly 1 million kids in our country were suffering child poverty. And he thought in a country as rich as ours, that should not be the case. That was something he put forward, and it was voted on unanimously. And I think many people thought it was just a proposition or a value statement. But for Ed, he believed fundamentally that is the work of government, to make sure people are protected, to use the power we have to lift up the people around us. Now, sadly, there has been some advances, but then a lot of step back. And to this day, right now, there are still 1 million kids that are, according to many reports, living in poverty. UNICEF in 2021 put out a report that for the first time in 2021, the rate or the number of children in child poverty was actually increasing. This should give us some serious pause. And it really reminds us that the legacy of Ed Broadbent's work is that we must continue to fight hard. Another thing about Ed is that he would never have said that Canada is broken. He would say that Canada needs to do more and can do a lot more and must do more to lift up the people around us. He was committed to that. He believed in the power of persuasion. He believed that we should never stop listening to each other.
I don't mean to interrupt the honourable member from Burnaby South, but I'm going to ask the Sergeant at Arms if he could just go outside to ask people who are outside of the chamber to try to keep things down so that the House can hear the member from Burnaby South continue with his tribute to Mr. Broadbent. The honourable member from Burnaby South.
Thank you very much. He fundamentally believed in the power of persuasion, that we could persuade to see the better way forward, that we should never stop listening to each other, even if we disagree. He was not afraid to fight. He would take on a fight directly with the political opponents, but he was also someone that was known for his ability to work together with people, to find the common ground that we could work together on, and to build a brighter future for everyone. He believed fundamentally that we needed to lift up wages. We need better wages. He spoke about not just the rights of women, but the economic rights of women many years ago, when maybe it wasn't as common that people would bring that up. And he reminded us of our fundamental commitment to Indigenous people, something that remained a major priority throughout his life. He spoke to me a number of occasions, and as a new leader of a political party, one that he was such a legend in, I have to thank him from the bottom of my heart for something that he did that was very special to me. Maybe when I was elected as leader, I wasn't what people imagined when they thought about what a leader would look like. And when I first was elected finally as a member of parliament, and I was introduced formally in our caucus meeting, Ed Broadbent was there. And he wanted to use the respect that he had gained, not just in the New Democratic Party, but the respect he had gained across the country, and say that he stood beside me and said that, yes, he belonged. And I thank him to this day for that generosity. In fact, anytime I asked Ed for help, he always said yes. Whether it was advice or meeting up for lunch or coming to introduce me at caucus or campaigning in Lansdowne Farmers Market, he was there for me. And I just can't imagine what that meant for someone that at that age could have been doing so many other things with his time. For him to mentor a young leader just again shows that generosity of spirit, his willingness to continue to give back. And I hope that in the future I could give back even a small degree the way that he did throughout his life. I want to also reflect on his advice that he gave me about the supply and confidence agreement. Now, he was very proud of the work that we did. He told me he was proud of the dental care program, that it was in the tradition of Tommy Douglas to make sure people had access to dental care. So he's proud of that. But he was concerned. Thank you. He was concerned about a number of things, though. He was concerned that in the very New Democrat tradition, he wanted us to do more, and he wanted it to be faster. And he was also very concerned about the Liberals, and he did not want them to be let off the hook. So I promised him that I would make sure I did all those things. I want to say a big thank you to Ed. I want you to know, Ed, that we will not let you down. We will keep on fighting for that vision of a more equitable society that you believed in. We've got lots of work. We're going to keep on fighting. And Ed, you're still who I want to be when I grow up.
The Honourable Member for Beauséjour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
House to pay tribute on behalf of the Government of Canada and the Liberal Caucus to an eminent Canadian who sadly left us earlier this month, the Honourable Ed Broadbent. On January 11th, Canada lost a man who, for decades, had been a fixture of our democratic life. For over half a century, he was one of Canada's most compassionate and respected voices. He has been at the epicenter of some of the most defining debates in modern Canadian history. Debates from repatriating the Constitution and enacting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the 1980s, to the national debate over free trade with the United States of America, to elevating the plight of children in poverty onto the national consciousness and tirelessly advocating for more ambition in putting an end to it, something that my honourable friend, the leader of the New Democratic Party, just referred to. He brought compassion and thoughtfulness to every debate. Il est né à Oshawa.
He was born in Oshawa, Ontario in 1936, while Canada was still gripped by the poverty of the Great Depression. His parents called him John Edward Broadbent, but of course, we all knew him as Ed. This name reflected his behavior. He was completely without pretension. He treated others always with respect. This was a characteristic that was the heart of everything Ed Broadbent did as a young university student, as an MP, as leader of the federal New Democratic Party, as an advocate for human rights and democracy here in this House, but also throughout the world.
Unlikely politician, but one whose determination and deeply rooted values propelled him to the forefront of our national conversations. In the 1968 federal election, after a stint in academia, he ran for the federal NDP in the then riding of Oshawa-Whitby. And as my colleague, the NDP leader, said, he defeated his closest opponent that night by just 15 votes in what was, in fact, a close three-way race. That would mark the beginning of a remarkable career as a member of Parliament that would, in fact, stretch over decades. And in 1975, following an earlier unsuccessful attempt at the NDP leadership mantle, Mr. Broadbent was elected leader of his political party. His tenure at the helm would last 14 years until 1989 and see him steer the party through 4 general elections. Au cours de cette période,
throughout that period, his passion would leave no one indifferent in the House. He led his troops by relentlessly putting his party's priorities on the political agenda. His incisive style during question period led to very dark discussions between him and the prime ministers that he questioned. He regularly faced Prime Ministers Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Brian Mulroney, measuring his talent as a speaker and debater with theirs. He proved to be a very stubborn opposition leader and won over the respect of all those who found him on the opposite side of the House. When Ed Broadbent spoke, his parliamentary colleagues would stop what they were doing and they would listen. Mr. Speaker, he showed us the best of what the House of Commons can be. He showed us that in a parliamentary democracy, we can debate each other without stooping to lows. He showed us that the very essence of this chamber is to be a place for debate and the exchange of ideas.
In 1989, he was appointed the founding director of the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development, leading the nonprofit's work in countries around the world until 1996. In 2004, as my colleague just noted, he returned to the political arena, winning the riding of Ottawa Centre for the New Democratic Party. Though his second stint would only last 2 years, during this time, Mr. Broadbent brought his trademark thoughtfulness to his interventions and was a source of counsel to many of his colleagues, including me. In 2011, he founded the Broadbent Institute, a social democratic policy think tank built on the Broadbent principles, and thus his legacy continues to this day. On a personal note, Mr. Speaker, I was privileged to get to know Ed and his then wife, Lucille, as they were longtime and close friends of my mother's and my stepfather's. I will always treasure the many evenings at my mother's home, sometimes with a cigar when Mr. Broadbent and my stepfather were there, and it was always the source of an interesting conversation, of wise advice and wise counsel, and like so many who had the privilege of getting to know Mr. Broadbent personally, he also had an important impact on my political thinking, and for that, I will always be grateful. Mr. Speaker, Canada is a better place for having had Ed Broadbent as one of its citizens and one of its servants. And this chamber is a better place for having had Mr. Broadbent as one of its members. So as I said, on behalf of the Government of Canada and my colleagues in the Liberal caucus, I want to extend our deepest condolences to Mr. Broadbent's family. May he rest in peace, and may his wonderful legacy live on through the generations. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Oshawa.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of Oshawa's constituents and our Conservative caucus, I rise this afternoon to join members in paying tribute to one of my esteemed predecessors, the late Honourable Ed Broadbent, who served as a member for the riding of Oshawa-Whitby and Oshawa from 1968 to 1989. Across my community, from the shop floors of General Motors and the local 222 Hall, in hockey rinks, or in any of Oshawa's countless cultural centres, there was only one Ed. After World War II, Oshawa underwent a surge of immigration from Europe. Though many may have struggled with their adopted tongue early on, most would learn instantly that recognize the name of Ed. In many cases, Ed was the first name they'd ever voted for in a democratic election. Ed was gifted, brilliant, and a clear thinker. He bore a sharp mind and a sharp wit. He was a scholar, philosopher, and a doting teacher. Ed was an icon within his beloved New Democratic family and a strong ally of Canada's unions. He was lively and engaged, a man who exhibited heart, spirit, and determination, and that's the one thing about Ed. He was always so darn determined and effective. Ed surprised many in Oshawa during the general election in 1968. He edged out our beloved late friend, Canada's first Ukrainian-Canadian cabinet minister, the Honourable Michael Starr, by a mere 15 votes. After one of our city's closest election contests, one beloved Oshawa legend bequeathed his legacy of service and compassion to a rising star. I first met Ed when he was doing the usual politician thing during an election at my front door. To set the Oshawa scene of the day, Mr. Speaker, there was a sea of NDP signs, except for the big PC sign in front of our house. So I stuck around to witness the encounter between my dad, a staunch conservative, and Ed. I thought, this is going to be good, fun to watch. Ed insisted on speaking with my dad, listened to what he had to say, and respectfully bid adieu and agreed to disagree. My father remarked, right guy, wrong party. Ed's hometown success wasn't just due to his political strike, but rather his deep resolve, a profound sense of purpose, and his common touch. And that's something that never changed with Ed over the years, even after politics. Whether driving his Chevette through Oshawa in the 1980s or in more recent years out for a jaunt on his bike here in his Centertown neighborhood, he had a smile and a kind word for everyone. When we were both elected in 2004, after my very close win in Oshawa, not quite the 15 votes win that he first experienced, we met on the floor of the House later in the fall. It was a day I won't forget. He greeted me with a big handshake and a warm grin, his hallmark. He shared several words of advice and encouragement. But he was also concerned that an Oshawa boy, me, had somehow ended up on the wrong team. To which I replied, we're both on the same team, Ed. We're on Team Oshawa and we both drive the right cars. He gave me a big pat on the back and said, that's the spirit, let's get to it, Colin. Whenever we ran into each other during those few years we served together, Ed always had a few suggestions and some quite pointed remarks, just like a stern teacher. In 2005, Speaker Milliken hosted a parliamentarian dinner for the newer MPs, and I was pleasantly honored to be able to sit next to Ed. We had a wonderful chat filled with Oshawa stories. I said to him that I learned from him, and he pleasantly replied, maybe a bit too much. Ed came from the era when politicians could be strong opponents but remain cordial and supportive. I'm pleased to have been here long enough to say that I miss those days. As we parted that evening, I remember his words to me. He said, Colin, I wish you the best of luck and future. Personally, I think it was Ed's humorous way of saying right man, wrong party. Gracious with his time, Ed made everyone feel like they were important, and that what they had to say was important. He always put relationships first. Ed cared deeply about those who studied with him, worked with him, or campaigned with him. Though he'll be remembered as one of Canada's most influential leaders, we should recall a man who believed deeply in humanity. Although many folks never agreed with his policies or platforms, there was always an unquestionable earnestness and sincerity about Ed. His efforts were always directed at driving us closer to his understanding of our shared aspirations. Mr. Speaker, I believe this is why so many people in Oshawa and across Canada feel Ed's passing in such a personal way. To Ed's surviving family, stepson Paul, daughter Christine, grandchildren Nicole, Gareth, Caitlin, Brett, great-grandchildren Alice and Freya, and to Ed's life partner Francis and his surviving former spouse Yvonne, we extend our most sincere condolences. Oshawa is forever grateful that you, the Broadbent family, shared Ed with us. We, in turn, are proud to have shared Oshawa's son, our Ed, with all Canadians, and for having known you, Ed. Miigwech, merci. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de B.
The Honourable Member for Bécancour, Nicolas Sorel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the Bloc Québécois, and as the Dean of this House, it is an honour to rise to celebrate the memory of Ed Broadbent, the third leader of the New Democratic Party, who passed away at the age of 87. The broader NDP family lost more than a former leader on January 11th. It lost the incarnation of a vision who, 35 years after being leader of the party, had almost become its identity. Believe it or not, I sat in this House with Ed Broadbent as leader of the NDP. From 1984 to 1989, 5 years. Just as I continued to have the honor to sit beside a caucus of 25 of his successors. His nickname was Honest Ed. and his influence has not disappeared over the years. Perhaps because he led the NDP from 1975 to 1989. That is the longest period in the history of the party. Over the 4 elections where he led, the party solidified its position in Ottawa and met with its greatest electoral success. His dynamic personality was part of his success. At the peak of his career, he was at the head of polls asking Canadians who their favorite politician was. It was his vision of a more egalitarian Canada that ultimately led to his influence lasting for decades. He was born in a working-class family in Oshawa, and then he was member for that same riding from 1968. His mission was to represent the working class and workers themselves on the federal political scene. He fought for democracy. A democracy that went beyond civil rights and included social and economic rights for everyone. A democracy where everyone would have a right to a life of dignity and a chance to realize their full potential. His vision of social justice played a key role in solidifying the relationship between his party and unions. His vision also enabled the NDP to move towards the left and to find more enthusiasm among Canadians. Ed was a remarkable parliamentarian. He had a rich vocabulary, an extremely strong critical thinking sense, and great talents as an orator. When he rose at question period, ministers trembled. Mr. Speaker, I would like to tell everyone an anecdote. Ed would always prepare his 2 questions very well and would express them very clearly. But at one point, during a major strike, he rose in the House with a very well-structured question for the responsible minister, for that file. Then the minister rose and said, "I wish to inform the leader of the NDP that there has been an agreement and the strike has been settled for the past half hour." So everyone thought that Mr. Broadbent would have no way to move on to the next question. With great dignity, he rose and said, "The minister has done great work in this file and we should all applaud him." So he showed great dignity and saved face, and everyone was very impressed by his spontaneous and appropriate response to the situation. In 1988, for the first time in its history, the NDP, with the most popular leader in Canada at the time, became a credible option throughout Canada. However, the fact that Ed Broadbent was the most popular party leader in Canada did not lead to success throughout Canada. Ed Broadbent left the NDP as leader in 1989, but he only left as leader. He never left the NDP, nor did he leave politics. And in fact, he briefly came back to this House as an MP from 2004 to 2006. But it was mostly behind the scenes that he continued to support his party and political thinking throughout Canada. The most salient point of the second part of his career was certainly the fact that in 2011 he created the eponymous Broadbent Institute. This think tank will perpetuate his vision of politics. With its own media and providing training for activists, the Institute will continue to spread Mr. Broadbent's ideas. For new generations of political leaders like the mayor of Montreal, Valérie Plante, which was part of the board. Mr. Broadbent is no longer among us, but his influence will survive, as will the memories of him in the hearts of those who loved him. On behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I would like to offer my sincere condolences to his spouse, 2 children, grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. I'd also like to offer my condolences to his political family in the NDP and all those who knew him professionally or personally. Thank you, John Edward Broadbent, for having devoted your life to public service. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Saanich Gulf Island.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. C'est un grand honneur pour moi de prendre la parole.
It's a great honor for me to rise this afternoon to add my words to the extraordinary words of our colleague, the Dean of this House.
Thank the strong words and memories shared from the Honourable Member from Beausejour. And particularly, I think I was moved by the Honourable Member from Oshawa for expressing so clearly that sense of what politics used to be like. At yesterday's state funeral, Brian Topp, in his address, referred to Ed Broadbent's time in politics as being a place where he continually displayed that you could disagree without being disagreeable. I had the honor to know Ed Broadbent before I got into politics. I didn't even join a political party till 2006, but I was kind of noisy from my role as an environmental activist. And quite often, I can remember times that Ed Broadbent and I got along fabulously well. Once I entered politics, we had the occasional moment where we disagreed. Famously, though, I never did get to debate Ed Broadbent in any leaders' debates, but in 1988, he actually referred to my resignation from the government of the day over a point of principle to rather make a point of the failures on some of the aspects of environmental policies. He put it to Brian Mulroney. I can tell you nothing quite alerts someone who's watching a long leaders debate like finding yourself mentioned by Ed Broadbent in the midst of the debate. I was deeply grateful then for his support for the stand I took. I'm grateful to this day. I reflected, first of all, I do want to say a thank you to the Prime Minister for the decision to have a state funeral. It isn't easily done. It's rare, but I think certainly the words from the Honourable Member from Burnaby South, we all appreciated the opportunity to share with Ed's family in expressing our deep sorrow at his loss and our gratitude for a life well lived. In the course of yesterday's funeral, I think it was Jonathan Sass, the co-writer of Ed's new book, who referred to Ed Broadbent's first speech in this place. I remember his last speech, and I went back and found it to see if I remembered it accurately. It was May 5th, 2005. And I recommend people who want to watch something wonderful. He was surrounded by so many other people I really love watching it on YouTube. There was Bill Blakey, there was Alexa McDonough, and Ed Broadbent's last speech shared some advice that I think is worth repeating for all of us who remain working in this place. What Ed Broadbent talked about on May 5th, 2005, and it's been mentioned already that he served in this place on behalf of, as the member for Oshawa from 1968 till 1990, but came back in 2004 as the Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre. In his speech, he reflected on how many people had asked him in that interregnum between leaving the House of Commons in 1990 only to return 14 years later in 2004, did he see a difference? And he reflected in that speech on the decline, this will sound familiar, Mr. Speaker, the decline in decorum, the increasingly partisan nature of debate. Quote, he said, "I note the decline in the civility of debate." He said, May 5th, 2005. If I were a high school teacher, I would not want to bring my students here anymore. He said, there's a difference between personal remarks based on animosity and vigorous debate. And he urged the members of Parliament there present, and I think those words should extend to us here right now, to restore to our politic a civilized tone. And in closing, he turned to the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to say that they apply in this place. And he read these words that we must, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, recognize the inherent dignity and the equal and unalienable rights of all members of the human family, and that recognition of inherent rights is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in this world. So in honor of Ed Broadbent, in honor of his legacy, and for all those parliamentarians who've served in the House of Commons before us and those who will follow after us, let us try to listen to our better angels, as Premier of Manitoba, the Honourable Wab Kinew, said yesterday. Us listen to our better angels. Let the quality and the character of our debate be elevated as we recognize in each other our shared humanity, our common commitment to Canada, and that we agree on far more than those things on which we disagree, that we serve our God, our country, our community, and our planet by expressing ourselves grounded in mutual respect and recognition of our shared humanity. Thank you for your leadership at Broadbent. May you rest in peace.